Hello and welcome to the Beyond Shakespeare podcast. I'm your host, Robert Crighton, General Overseer of the Beyond Shakespeare podcast, which specialises in creating full-cast audio adaptations of drama from before 1642, as well as providing background and other production resources. You can support our work and get a say into what we produce by becoming a patron today. Go to www.patreon.com/Beyond Shakespeare. At the time of recording this, we're about to go into our next vote, so from just $1 a month, you can actually tell us what you want us to produce. Anyway, today it's time for some more discussion of a play or plays, and if you've produced a production of any early play that fits our remit, don't hesitate to actually get in touch. We love to help archive the practical side of producing plays, especially plays with, shall we say, a slightly thinner production history. So, if you've produced anything similar to what we're discussing today, you can email me at admin@beyondshakespeare.org and say hello. And remember, beyond is the operative term there. Today's episode is a discussion I had late last year with Dr. Jeff S. Dailey about John Bale's biblical plays.
My name is Jeff Dailey. I'm retired, and since I've retired, I've been focusing my time on all the scholarship that I couldn't do when I was working. So I alternate between theater works and musicology.
Dr. Jeff S. Dailey earned his PhD in theatre from NYU with additional study elsewhere. Perhaps he can better explain how these things came about and why he came to look at the plays of John Bale in connection with his studies.
I actually did things backwards. I got my PhD in theater before going to get a master's degree. But it's all kind of came together, and actually that's one of the things that I like about it, because it enables me to combine my three big interests, which are theater, music, and theology together in one project. So, I'm very grateful for John Bale for that.
Yes, I can't think of anyone actually who's better for that actually, because you have got some music, you've got all the theology.
So, John Bale's biblical plays, of which there are, or at least for this episode, 3. God's Promises, which covers the Old Testament prophets. John Baptist's Preaching in the Wilderness, which covers John Baptist's preaching in the wilderness, as well as his baptizing of 3 representative people from society, a confrontation with a Pharisee and Sadducee, and his eventual baptism of Christ. The final play in the sequence, and it was a sequence, is The Temptation of Our Lord, and is similarly self-explanatory, as Satan tempts Christ and is rejected. These 3 plays are fairly short and were written after the Reformation as a Protestant replacement for the Catholic mystery plays. Jeff Dailey produced the 2 New Testament plays, John Baptist and Temptation, in 2017 and has worked on producing God's Promises. So we will talk about all 3, dancing about a bit, but hopefully clearly. Luckily for you, dear listener, we've recorded some rough versions of all 3 plays, either in our plain text version of God's Promises or in workshop recordings of the other 2, examples of which punctuate this discussion, as does a brief excerpt from a Robin Hood play. And you can go and hunt them out on the podcast at your leisure, should you wish. We also mention in passing the 2 other Bale plays that survive, 3 Laws and King John, but sadly I ran out of time on this episode to go into them. Also, for context, we were talking just after the American midterms in 2018, so as not to confuse people listening in the far future. Those are the elections we're referencing. But for now, let's let the talking do the talking.
The reason why I wanted to talk to you was I believe you did work on John Bale's biblical plays last year, if the internet is not lying to me.
Well, it's actually been an ongoing project. The initial study, I gathered a group of actors together, and we read through 2 of the plays, John Baptist Preaching in the Wilderness and The Temptation of Our Lord, to just see how theatrical they were. And on the basis of that, then, I was very fortunate to have the producer of the American Theater of Actors here in New York City. His name is James Jennings, and he put one of his theaters at my disposal to do a production. So that's how that came about.
So in that initial reading, how did the actors find the 2 plays?
The actors, at the feedback we had after it, the talkback we had after it, they agreed that it was all performable. I think one of the problems with John Bale, if it indeed is a problem, is the fact that he writes in rhyming verse. And so actors and audiences who are familiar with non-rhyming verse can get thrown off by that. I'm thinking in many theatrical situations, and I'm thinking about things such as some of the English translations of Moliere. How should I say this? The use of rhyme implies comedy. And when you have what is basically a serious play that is rhyming, that kind of confuses the audience. Now, obviously, John Bale wrote as a continuum because mystery plays and other medieval theater in English is in rhyming verse, but most audiences are not familiar with that. So, and actually, I found the John Bale plays, as to the rhyming, work pretty well. The problem I've had when I've done earlier plays from the Middle Ages is that many of the words have changed or the pronunciations have changed, so the rhyming is not as easy to follow or to make it work.
Yes.
Whereas in Bale, I don't find that as often. Now, I've prepared performing editions of the 3 biblical plays, but I haven't had to change too much just to make it rhyme. I've simplified the language and I shouldn't say simplified. I've substituted things. The 2 basic things that have to be done is substituting the modern then for Bale's than.
Yes, we've had that quite a lot.
And there was another one too. It's for his. In most cases, I've just went ahead and just substituted them without worrying about it. There's also some of the conjunctions, such as with. There's often different uses of that word now, and so I've had to change a couple of things. But on the whole, you really don't have to change too much to make the verse very intelligible.
So that was your first starting point with that group of actors. Did you use the same actors going forward, or did you?
No, because it was a year later, and in New York, as I'm sure in London and other places, actors come and go.
Yes.
So actually, it was a different group of actors who then worked on the plays. They obviously were really not familiar with John Bale. So I worked with them on that. And again, they had to get used to, first of all, speaking the verse, which I've found actually there's not as much understanding of verse among current students or recent graduates. And at one point in my life, I was a professor of poetry, so I can, definitely agree with that. So it took time to get used to that and to, again, speaking both in rhythm and in rhyme. 2 rather tricky things for modern actors.
How long was the rehearsal period?
Around a month. And there was a significant bleed over. Thinking back on it, there was more than that. It was the same group of actors in both plays. So it's not like one could be rehearsed at one time and the other at another time. For the production, yes, we actually used the same group of actors for both plays because of the fact that moving people around and so on, some of the roles were doubled. So certain of the people actually had quite a significant amount of material to learn.
Did you use the same number of actors as would have been originally? So I think they were 4.
I used 7.
7.
I did use the same actor for Jesus in both parts. And at one point, Jesus also had to substitute as the armed man, which is actually easy to do because he got to wear a helmet.
Yeah.
So it covered things up pretty well.
So in terms of how did you approach the actual staging of it? You say you've made minor editorial changes. Did you make any cuts, or otherwise did the text remain very much the same?
No, the text we did completely as written. They're short enough that that's not necessary. The other thing is in the 2 plays that were staged, the St. John play and the Temptation play, there is for Bale surprisingly little anti-Roman Catholic rhetoric as compared to the other plays. So there really wasn't any need to tone that down.
Well, there's a reasonable chunkette in John Baptist's preaching, or there's a substituted sense with the Pharisee and the Sadducee.
Oh, yes,
there's a sort of a subtle dig, well, not very subtle dig, but that's sort of what was supposed to be implied, I think.
Well, I'm sure he implied a lot of things, but compared to things such as 3 laws,
yes.
Or even parts of King John, there is significantly less. basically what I found in the play. There is the one section in The Temptation of Our Lord where he talks about the Bishop of Rome will be my friend. That's really the only section in the plays itself. In the prologues and epilogues that were spoken by Bale himself, there was more. In the one play, and I think it was the first one, where Bale as epilogue just recites a whole list of popes. Obviously, he meant something at that point that meant a lot more to the audience at the time than does now, because these were just names that most people didn't even understand at all. So,
did you keep both the prologues and epilogues as well, or did you?
Yes.
Yeah.
And actually, I had an actor who grew a beard and looked pretty much like John Bale in his woodcut.
Who does look remarkably miserable, I have to say.
You wouldn't have to look far to find him unhappy about things.
No.
I mean, in reading through his autobiography, you read it and you say, why did you do that? Why?
Looking at those performance, the performance in Ireland when he's over there, and it's just he's poking the bear very deliberately. And utterly unreasonable behaviour in so many different ways. It's a miracle he got out alive.
He survived into his 60s at a time, well, first of all, many people didn't, but more so, people of his political and religious persuasion didn't. Definitely his life had a lot of highs and lows, to being captured by pirates to being a bishop. So, that's quite a change in one's lifestyle. He probably could have gotten more done if he was more willing to compromise or to do things more gradually, both in Ireland and even then when he went back to Canterbury. The reports of what happened there, granted he often had a very hostile group of people to work with. It is my opinion that when he returned to England in Elizabeth's reign, he did not go back to Ireland, but instead was assigned as a canon in Canterbury. Canterbury at that point had become a very pro-Roman Catholic place. And I actually think he was placed there not so much as a retirement setting, but to kind of turn the place around. And he obviously did a good job of antagonizing people there, and eventually managed to get all the anti-Anglican people ultimately out of there.
Yes, that sense of there is no compromise, and he remains uncompromising throughout. Did I see that you at least did a read-through of God's promises as well?
That has still not happened.
That hasn't happened. Oh, right.
I am planning on that. God's promises is a whole different sort of play. It's more like a sermon. It is basically God and a prophet talking in dialogue, and then they sing an antiphon, and then the next prophet comes out. Even though there is a stage direction in it for Adam to fall down on the ground. And
roll over, is it 3 or 4 times? I think it's a very specific number of times he's supposed to roll in the stage direction.
So I actually, my original plan was just to do it as a reading, and I probably will at some point. It's not the most interesting of plays, especially if you're not very familiar with the Old Testament, and especially if you're not familiar with the Latin names of the prophets in the Old Testament, because he uses, although the play is written in English, he uses the titles from the Vulgate. It's not always as easy to figure that out. And not to mention the fact, God does not come off looking pretty good in that play.
Oh, he's a miserable sod.
Yeah.
He's angry all the time.
I think actually he's more like John Bale.
Yes.
At that point. And the only thing is that if you look at the play from beginning to end, he does soften up each time around, in each of the scenes, which Bale calls acts. On the whole, I don't find it nearly as rewarding as the other 2 biblical plays. There are issues with the John the Baptist play, John Baptist preaching in the wilderness. There's not enough conflict in it, except for the scene with the Pharisee and the Sadducee. In the other parts, it's mostly people agreeing with each other, because John comes in and he talks to the 3 characters and he says, you have to change your ways. And basically they say, okay, we will. Then you have the scene with the Pharisee and the Sadducee, and that's really where there's some sort of dramatic conflict. And then you have the scene between Jesus and John, where it's John doing the conflict, saying, no, I shouldn't have to baptize you. But again, he doesn't hold off for too long on that. And so it's basically a play of people just agreeing to do what the other person wants. And while that's perfectly good theology, it's not very good dramatic structure.
Well, there's an interesting question that comes immediately from that, which is what he does with the first three people he's talking to. He's doing something that I don't think any of the previous mystery cycles did with their John Baptist. I mean, there might be lost plays that we don't know about. But the sense that the whole mechanics of baptism, of actually you'll be washed clean, you start again. And these three people build from first person who hasn't really done anything particularly wrong, second person who's a bit of a cove, to the third person who's raped and murdered.
Yes.
And actually to present that to an audience and saying, this is what this thing that we have always done, this is what it actually means. And so I'm wondering if the conflict isn't so much, and obviously it's not much help for staging it today, whether that conflict is more for the audience than it is actually for the people on stage.
Well, I agree with you completely because as you can even tell from the characters' names, they are archetypes to represent all of humanity. So, you have the regular person, the politician, and the soldier. And that basically, no matter how sinful these people are, their sins will be washed away. And perhaps, I don't know how it is all that much in the United Kingdom these days. We just had election day here, and there's a lot of political sins that need to be washed away at this point here in the U.S.
We have a never-ending litany of sins floating around the ether at the moment. It's carnage.
So, I mean, maybe that's the message we can use the play for today, is that no matter how terrible the politicians are, they ultimately can be forgiven.
Maybe. I'll you'll have to convince me on that one. What part did music play in your productions? Music obviously seems very important to Bale. All the plays seem to reference some option.
Yes. Yeah, there's not as much in this play. Just towards the end of The Temptation, where he says, okay, the angels sing a sweet song. One of the things that's holding up my reading of God's promises is there are very specific antiphons that are to be performed. And I've started the process of underlaying Bale's translation to the Sarum chant of the time. But that's taken longer than expected.
But the music's so important to make the play function. It functions more like an oratorio than it does a play. Yes. And I think that seems to be the route in.
The other thing is has to do with the instrumental accompaniment and in God's promises, because the words in Latin that he uses, he says they sing cum organis. There's a couple of ways to interpret that. The modern translation would be with an organ, and that's interesting from the point of view of musical performance practice from this time, because it shows a changing over from plain song being sung unaccompanied to being sung accompanied. But there's other issues too, because the one clear description we have of this play being performed is outside. But there was a history of portable organs in this time period. We know that Henry VIII had a number of them. These positive organs, as they're called, are definitely possibly used for this. And especially since it does seem to see from the description in the Bale's biography, that's what was used in the outdoor performance there. Bearing in mind, of course, that at the time, organs didn't need electricity and needed to have another person there to pump it. So that's a possibility. It also could have been a reed organ, what was called at the time a regal. But another interpretation that I've thrown out there is the fact that the word organ doesn't necessarily mean organ. It can also mean instrument. And we use that in the modern terminology of organology, which is the branch of musicology that deals with musical instruments, not just organs. And there is also evidence from the time of actors playing and singing on stage various instruments, simultaneously. You'll find that in one of the plays, Tom Tyler and his wife.
Oh, yes, yes.
And also in John Redford's Wit and Science. There's different ways that this could be done. Bale, later on in his life, became very anti-organ, which perhaps is more of the Puritan awakening of him, because the Puritans didn't like organs at all. So that's these are some of the issues that need to be brought into bear on performing this play. But again, and I think in this play especially, the music is very important. Now, first of all, Bale obviously had a background in music. If you're familiar with the manuscript of King John, he actually has written out some musical notation. He obviously had a background in that, probably as part of his ecclesiastical training in the Carmelite monastery. You mentioned the use of music throughout. I think for God's promises, the music serves a very important, like almost wake-up call to the audience at the end of each section, because it's not the best constructed play, at least from a modern sensibility.
Yeah, I think it's that thing. It's structured so very rigidly. You have the 7 acts; they're almost exactly the same length. They do exactly the same thing. If you know in advance there are 7 acts, you're going to get to about Act 4 and start going, "Oh dear God!" But I mean, but that ritualistic element might be to its advantage. And that's the thing, is without the music, I really can't tell. I mean, I think actually some of the acts have great drama to them. The game for the actors is, how do you persuade God to change his mind? Yes. And it's the repetition which is the problem, yeah. I think. There's almost 1 or 2 too many acts in it.
I agree with you. I'm thinking especially of the act with Noah.
Yes, literally just been looking at it, and, he starts off so angry, plotting this genocide, and then he is actually, I think he does actually say, "You've changed my mind. Thy righteousness doth move me somewhat to reserve for mankind's posterity."
Utterly from man avert not then thy face, but let him savour thy sweet benevolence, somewhat, though he feel thy hand for his offence.
My true servant Noah, thy righteousness doth move me somewhat to reserve for man's posterity. Though I drown the world, yet will I save the lives of thee, and thy wife, thy 3 sons, and their wives, and of each kind too, to maintain you hereafter.
Blessed be thy name, most mighty merciful Maker. With thee to dispute, it were inconvenient.
So, Noah has actually changed God's mind, which is a very interesting theological position.
Yes, I think, like I said, individually, I think they work, reasonably well. As I said, it is really an overwhelmingly gloomy play. Again, looking at it from a modern perspective, at the time, people may not have felt the same way. I also like the gradual change that comes about in the scene with Abraham, where it's like, okay, well, if I can find 10 people, okay, well, if I can find 20 people, or the other way around, actually, it goes from the largest number to the smallest number.
Be not angry, Lord, though I speak undiscreetly.
Utter thy whole mind, and spare me not hardily.
Peradventure there may be 30 found among them?
May I find 30, I will nothing do unto them.
I take upon me too much, Lord, in thy sight.
No, good Abraham, for I know thy faith is right.
No less, I suppose, than 20? Can it have?
Could I find 20, that city would I save.
Once yet will I speak my mind, and then no more.
Spare not to utter so much as thou hast in store.
And what if there might be 10 good creatures found?
The rest, for their sakes, might so be safe and sound, and not destroyed for their abomination.
O merciful Maker, much is thy toleration and sufferance of sin. I see it now.
That is kind of interesting. If you're familiar with the biblical story, you know how it's going to end. We also need, I think, to always remember that these were really written as educational pieces. At the time, this was, I think, a very useful means of propaganda.
Yes, certainly by this point we've got a lot of propagandizing going on with drama, not just with religious drama, but also in a sort of the more wider political sense.
Sure, definitely, yeah.
If that's God's promises, we've sort of vaguely covered a bit of John Baptist's preachings. Any more thoughts on John Baptist's preaching in terms of how did it go down, that as a play?
It went pretty well. although not as I personally have a great preference for The Temptation of Our Lord.
Yes.
But the interesting things, first of all, how to handle the baptism. And this is something I put a lot of thought into, because there is a theory that, especially if plays were performed outdoors, you could make use of pre-existing bodies of water. And there's, among the Robin Hood plays of the Middle Ages, it's thought that that happened. But
now am I, Friar, within, and thou rubbing without. To lay thee here I have no great doubt. Now art thou rubbing without, and I, Friar, within. Lie then.
The truth is, throwing Friar Tuck into the water is not the same as, John the Baptist baptizing someone, because obviously you need to maintain the seriousness of the whole thing. So the thought of doing it by immersion, even though that would probably be biblically correct, isn't terribly useful theatrically. So what I ended up doing with that is I had a fountain on stage, and John used the water from the fountain to, just pour a little water on each of the characters. And there wasn't enough water to make the stage wet to cause a safety issue. The other thing that comes up with that play is how to handle the dove at the end. Because, it is possible to train birds to do things, but it's easier to train them to fly away than to come to a specific spot you want. So I'm pretty sure it was not a live dove at the time.
Oh, no, I think we can assume some theatrical effect was planned. Yes.
I mean, it was probably a taxidermy dove that could have been suspended from a string and a stick. I actually used a puppet and had the actress who was going to, in the next play, perform one of the angels, came in her angel costume with the puppet. And we used the dove puppet to fulfill the stage direction. Sort of like in Japanese bunraku, where the puppeteer is completely in sight of the audience and you make no attempt to cover it up. So those were some of the interesting things from that play from a theatrical perspective.
Because we did find how did the Pharisees and the Sadducees go down? They are sort of there as proxies for Catholic priests.
Yes, very much so. Yes. They're really stand-ins for Roman Catholic clergy. And the fact that it never resolves, in other words, they storm off stage at the end, kind of shows that the project of the Reformation was still ongoing, because they needed to, they don't surrender. Unlike everyone else in that play who gives in, they do not. And I think it's more of an opportunity for John, who represents the correct way of looking at things, and the Pharisee and the Sadducee, who are what is the incorrect way. And he deftly parries their statements, but on the other hand, they don't convert.
For we shall none be of this newfangled school. We are men learned. We know the ancient laws of our forefathers. Thy news are not worth two straws.
The offspring we are of the noble father Abraham, and have blessings so many as of him came. We cannot perish, though thou prate never so much. For we are righteous, well learned, famous, and rich.
Great folly is it of Abraham so to boast. Where his faith is not, the kindred is soon lost.
And of course, we've also got the element of setting up for the later plays that we don't have. That sort of frustrating thing. We have this wonderfully long list of plays what he wrote. I mean, it's really interesting that conceiving a Protestant interpretation of the mystery cycles. God's Promises is quite radical in the sense that he does sort of just do away with the whole Old Testament in one quick, in an hour. He's sort of got it all out of the way, and there's no interest in the Old Testament almost at all, except as a sort of stepping stone. I mean, I'd really love to have the Thomas Becket play, but sadly, history has deprived us of that.
Yes.
So, moving on to The Temptation, then, which I can understand entirely why it would be your preferred play, shall we say, because it's a drama. It really is a drama. When we worked on it, there's a real battle of wits going on, a real struggle between Jesus and Satan in a way that the earlier mystery plays do not have.
I told the actors working on it to think of the relationship between the two as sort of an athletic rivalry, because it's only in that play where you have two characters who are more or less equal. You have to admit, until the very end, Satan holds his own.
Oh, he puts up some pretty good arguments. I'm with Satan for quite a lot of that.
When ye were hungry, I did ye first persuade of stones to make bread, but ye would none of that trade. Ye laid for yourself that scripture would not serve it. That was your buckler. But now I am for ye fit, for the suggestion that I now shall to thee lay. I have scripture at hand, ye shall not deny.
That's a continuation of the medieval tradition also, where Satan was always the best part. The best actors always wanted to play that part because basically you could do whatever you wanted to do. He's not constrained by morality. You actually have quite a bit of leeway, both as an actor and as a playwright, in what Satan does and says.
Well, it's also different. It's also different in the way Jesus is treated as well, in the sense that Jesus is also playing a long game with him.
Oh, definitely, yes.
Whereas in earlier ones, he sort of basically turns around and says, "You're Satan, go away," almost immediately. And he doesn't until the very end, when Satan sort of tips his hand a bit. It's like the costume is sort of, because he's wearing this disguise, for the listeners at home. He's wearing a disguise as a priest and changes his voice. The way he speaks is very different. And then towards the end of his argument with Jesus, it just slips and he starts being ruder and more coarse. And it's beautifully dramatic. I absolutely love it.
Well, I've worked with the actors, and actually I even wrote an article which has not yet been published, asking the question. The title of it is, Would Jesus Punch Satan? Because it gets to the point where they're very, very physical. And I have come across, throughout the Middle Ages, there are certain places where artistic representations of Jesus being far from placid. These are some of the interesting things that it raises. For example, there is a picture in a fresco by Giotto of Jesus about to punch a money changer. And there is also a 13th century manuscript called the De Braille Hours, which there's actually a wonderful picture of the Virgin Mary punching a devil.
Oh, right.
It's a British Library manuscript. It's an additional manuscript 49999. There's a book devoted to that, but also you can easily find that picture just by looking on the internet. So as I said, it's not this goes into, there is a whole movement in the 20th century of especially among American evangelicals about trying to interpret Jesus as a more heroic character. So you actually find some of that here even, where at the beginning of the play, he is very acquiescent, kind of accommodates Satan in all of his requests, including, the whole thing, let's climb this mountain together. And then it's not till the end that it rises to a climax when Jesus finally repudiates Satan. And as I said, in my production, pushes him against the wall and he falls down. And then at that point, Satan kind of turns to the audience. He brushes himself off and he stands up saying, I'll have to try someplace else now.
Yes, I'll go off to the Vicar of Rome. What gets me is that obviously the angels appear and they offer him food, and it's that sense of it. First time it feels like there's a struggle, that this has actually been, he's actually out there fasting, and then he's had this struggle with Satan, and that actually there's a very physical component to the fact that he's then starving and exhausted, and he's won, and the angels come there to feed him and give him lovely music.
And the interesting thing about that is that's completely extra-biblical.
Yes.
The angels and the food especially, and the song are things that Bale introduced. It would be interesting to know where he got that from. He obviously knew how to end a play, because he puts a fantastic ending to this struggle. It calms things down very significantly. He ends the play extremely well. The obviously the thing is, again, the focus on the educational perspective of it is with the presence of Bale as both the prologue and the epilogue.
Yes,
because
he just can't help jumping in, can he?
Well, he starts off each play telling the audience what they're going to see. Then they see the play. Then at the end, he comes back and tells them what they just saw. So I think that is probably useful just to help drive in the message that he has just illustrated. Actually, in many ways, the play itself is easier to understand than what he has put into his prologue and epilogue. It could also be that he just needed to be the master of ceremonies. I mean, notice he doesn't call it just the prologue and the epilogue. He actually gives us his name.
Yes, it's me, guys. It's me again.
So.
You get him 6 times if you watch if these 3 plays are performed one after the other, which we know in Ireland it was, and obviously the conception was that this would become a continuous cycle of some description. I also wonder about, dramatically, it's a question of, is he just getting better as a playwright, having done 2 or more plays before The Temptation, and he's just getting going as a writer in that sense?
We don't know the order in which he wrote them.
No.
I mean, he may have done it in biblical order, but maybe he didn't. The temptation story with the conflict between Jesus and Satan makes very good theater. And if artists have recognized it back from the beginning, there is a great deal of visual art documenting the temptation. Because again, it's a really good story.
I mean, with our workshop group, we did the Chester mystery Temptation, and we then did John Bale's one after the other to actually sort of compare and contrast. And whereas Chester is very theatrical and literally out as Satan, every time he gets bested, sort of goes off in a corner and goes, "Oh, he got me again." But it is serious, but it's also, there is that comic edge to it as well. It's this outward display. Whereas this play feels much more psychological, feels much more, I say, that's why I distinguished the two, as one being more theatrical and this being more dramatic, of really having a conflict that's not obviously going to be won. You get the impression Jesus is obviously going to win in the earlier versions, whereas in this, there's that he's going to win, but there is that sense there's enough struggle going on there.
Yes, and I think that's a good way to play it to the audience who may be struggling with things also. That shows the need for faith. When I preach, I've often said that people talk about doubt, and my point is that in theology you need doubt, because if you don't have doubt, then you don't need faith. Then there's nothing but certainty. And I would think that to people in the early 16th century, especially if they were not literate and who only knew their Bible from what was preached to them in church, there's probably quite a bit of doubt, especially if you're living in, a very difficult time. And so consequently, this shows that, everyone can have doubt. And ultimately, it resolves as we expect it to. And I think perhaps that's one of the reasons for the angels at the end is to provide not just to Jesus, but the comfort that they bring comes to the entire audience.
If the priests can't agree what the meaning is, that sense of uncertainty for anyone who's, in a sense, yes, the Reformation is introducing the idea that, hey, this book, you should all read it. It might be a good idea if people can actually understand, rather than have these intermediaries. And yes, literacy is growing, but that sense of the priests can't agree. Where do we stand? What's right? Which I don't think these plays necessarily resolve, but it must have been a very, very, very confusing time.
Yes,
for the average person. That's the thing. I think if you are educated, you've got a chance to make a reasoned decision.
But it also could have been one of the reasons behind Thomas Cromwell hiring Bale to go and tour plays around also. I think Thomas Cromwell obviously was a master propagandist also, and knew how to get the message out. And I think that works such as this, because obviously the people who were writing, and let's face it, there were tremendous amounts of theological works being produced at this time, including by Bale. But let's face it, most people don't read them. It's a very small class of people who would either have the ability or the time to read that much material. To get the word out to other people, I think the traveling theatrical troops, I think, worked extremely well. The bigger question I always have is, how did Bale end up getting started in theater? I think if I got to meet him someday, that would be the question I would ask him. Bale, who had been in a monastery since the age of 12. Now, then again, we have to realize that Western theater had its origins in the church. And so we see the connection there back to the Easter story. I think it's an interesting thing, but for someone to get up one day and say, okay, I'm going to go write a play so that other people will understand the Bible, I think that's I think a pretty interesting thing.
Well, yes, it's that thing of he maybe saw whichever local mystery play that was playing near him and just going, well, no, that's got it. That won't do. Got to start again. I mean,
the interesting thing is my interpretation of his description of the Irish performances on the day that Mary was crowned is that it was most likely done by students. He doesn't specifically say that, but I think he says something like by young men. So I'm imagining they were probably students who were probably working on this for a while. There's all these questions about the performance practice and the rehearsal practice at the time that I'm not sure we'll ever get clear answers on, but it would have been certainly interesting to see how that worked out. I mean, to see Bale as a director, directing his own work, I think would have been fascinating. And it's unfortunate we don't have, even a description of what happens, other than what Bale himself wrote.
And you do get the impression that Bale probably acted rather like a modern director as well. I mean, regardless of the then conventions, you just can't see Bale not telling everyone precisely what he wants them to do.
Well, and especially since he wrote it. So,
yeah, well, he's there. He's there because he's at the beginning and he's there at the end. So he's watching your every move. Yeah. Like a very malevolent Santa. So how did the show in the end go? I mean, what audience response? What worked? What didn't? What was the feedback?
In general, I got very positive feedback. The actors liked working on it, again, because it gave them significant experience experimenting with verse. In bulk, the people who spoke to me after it were people who came to it because of its religious content and enjoyed that aspect of the whole thing, with many of them asking, about upcoming reading of God's promises. In general, I think it works very well. At least the two plays we did, really work well on stage once you figure out the couple of problems. The other thing being with The Temptation of Our Lord is you need to have different levels worked out. Because you have the ground level, you have, the pinnacle and the top of the temple.
Yes, so there's a sense that there's some sort of journeying going on, and how do you make that work in presumably what sort of theatre space were you using?
It was a 65-seat proscenium theater.
Mm-hmm.
So what I did was I actually got a metal scaffolding that was then painted and covered with cloth. So, I mean, it didn't look like a mountain, but obviously you could get different levels of it there. And then also a set of steps on the side that was for the pinnacle of the theater. Because Bale uses a very interesting word, grieslings, meaning steps. The word isn't found very many places. So I did come across it in some non-dramatic texts of the time. It's not a very common word. So you have to have steps and you have to have a mountain. There's also the idea that as a touring production, they would have performed in all sorts of places, churches, outside, perhaps parish halls, that sort of thing. But for, actors can adapt to this sort of thing, the different need for levels. And we have the use of levels even back in the mystery plays, in the Herod plays, where Herod comes out and runs through the audience.
I think it's that element that we want, in a sense, to be able to say, the staging for these plays was done in a very specific way, or they did it this way, and the real answer is they staged it however it was practicable at the time.
Oh, definitely.
So if they were somewhere where they could get a decent bit of gear, sometimes the audience were raised up, sometimes the stage was raised up, sometimes they both were raised up, sometimes they went out amongst the audience, sometimes the audience was standing, sometimes they weren't. It really depended on the precise performance context, and however much we'd like it to be fixed, it just doesn't happen.
It's unfortunate that Bale in his autobiography doesn't talk more about how the plays were staged.
No, it's very. He just basically says, "Well, we did them," and everyone was a bit cross. And then these people died, and then we ran. Yes, it's always those gaps that are deeply, deeply frustrating.
Yes. But for someone who wrote as much as he did,
Yes.
it annoys me that he didn't write what I want to read.
No.
Because Bale saw theater being a powerful means of education. I see a connection with that in the education at the time, where focus was placed on debates. Because I think especially Marlowe's education, so that people debated things, and they debated religious things. And of course, in a debate, you have to have someone pro and someone con, and which meant that people actually had experience debating against religious doctrine, and which kind of threw things out there.
Well, in a sense, that's what we've mostly been doing this year, is actually doing a lot of the John Hayward plays are debate plays.
Yes.
And they're structured debates, and they're actually quite clever in the sense that often they don't leave a absolute answer. There's usually enough room for doubt to say, well, you make your own mind up at the end. But then there's plenty of other examples.
Well, I think
in pamphlets as well of the way the debate style was used to actually get an argument across.
Talking about debate plays, that is really what God's Promises is. I mean, it's unfortunate, as you pointed out earlier, that more of them weren't published. But I guess we should be happy that the ones that were are, and especially since they haven't survived terribly well. I mean, the single copy of John Baptist Preaching in the Wilderness disappeared sometime in the 18th century. And it's only that because it had been republished prior to that we have it today. And of the two copies that survive of The Temptation of Our Lord, one of them is incomplete.
Oh, considering how much we don't have, it's to have 5 plays, to have enough of a career to be able to get a sense of who he was as a writer. And obviously he wrote an awful lot of other stuff, so we've...
Yes, yeah.
I mean, you couldn't stop him writing, could you?
No. And I mean, and not all of it is bombastic propaganda. I mean, his work, especially on English literature, is very useful. And obviously he led a very interesting life, and more importantly, that he was the ultimate survivor.
Oh yes.
In a time when many others did not. That not only did he survive, but he refused to be cowed. He was not one who compromised. We've heard the term the fervor of a convert, and that was really him.
Yeah.
Because he was like, okay, I figured this out. I'm right, and you have to agree with me. Basically, that's it. So, but I think he's definitely a fascinating person.
I don't understand why a lot of these plays aren't done more often, because they have relatively small casts. On an economic basis, as speaking to someone who works in theatre a lot, 5 actors, depending on the play. I think we could swing that.
Yeah.
Small. Even without an Arts Council grant, we could probably just about make turn over a profit. So I don't quite understand why they're not done more often. But one day they will. That's sort of the point of the exercise. Any other thoughts? Because otherwise, I think we've covered everything pretty thoroughly. Any last thoughts about John Bale or your versions of John Bale?
Well, as I said, I really found the 2 New Testament plays work very well, and they work very well together. And again, the couple of staging issues that needed to be dealt with, we were able to deal with simply enough. And they can be done with relatively few props. I did add some stones in for Jesus and Satan to play with, and included some physical gags with that, whereas Satan, they were too heavy for Satan to pick up, but Jesus could pick them up and juggle them. Things of that sort. There's a lot of material there. I don't think once you get used to the rhyming that it's problematic. I know in various places Bale's theatrical verse has been called doggerel.
Yes, I don't think that's true at all. Yeah. I think that's utterly unfair. I mean, I think he's got his flaws as a playwright, but actually I think he knows how to structure a line.
And his, he certainly has an extensive vocabulary, and really at times makes some very, very witty choices in terms of sonics, in terms of the rhyme scheme. So I actually find that a positive, not a negative. And I think, again, it's for critics who are so used to blank verse that kind of get thrown off with things extensively rhyming. And again, the idea that it can rhyme and not be a comedy. God's promises, each act, God gets to be nicer until by the end, he's willing to let things go on. But I think that's in many ways projecting too much of humanity onto God.
Yes. How do you play God? It's a question we've been asking ourselves a lot over the years.
Well, interestingly, for the part where God talks in John Baptist's preaching, I actually didn't use one person. What I did was I had all the actors who were not on stage at the time read God's lines from off stage.
And so, I think it does say in the script, is it, that it's just the voice of God heard?
Again,
I might be thinking of a different play. We've worked on so many God plays.
Oh, actually, hold on. No, you're wrong. I'm wrong. It says, now descends upon Jesus the Holy Spirit in the form of a dove, and the voice of God in heaven is heard saying. So it is off stage, yes.
Yeah. Or however they decided to do it at the time.
Yeah. I actually think it was probably Bale himself who did that part.
I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah. So.
And I'd like to thank Dr. Jeff S. Dailey for joining me on this episode and for being very patient with my very delayed release of the episode. The excerpts used in this episode featured performances by Heydn, McCabe, Geir, Madland, Richard Fawcett, Alan Scott, Mark Holtom, and myself as an occasional god. The rest of the time, I've been your host, Robert Crighton. Support this podcast by going to patreon.com/Beyond Shakespeare, or you can follow us on Twitter @Beyond Shakes.